Imagine waking up on a cold morning more than 1,000 years ago. As you open your eyes, you do not hear the sound of a car or a television. You hear the crackle of a fire and the breathing of your family members nearby. You feel hungry, but there is no cereal box to grab and no milk in a plastic jug. If you want to eat, you have to remember where the dried meat was hung months ago. If you want a drink, you have to walk to a frozen stream and break the ice. In the world of the Vikings, life was very different from ours today. There were no grocery stores where you could buy bread, there were no banks where you could keep money, and in many places money did not even exist. There were no hospitals, no schools, and no police. For a Viking family, survival was a giant puzzle that they had to solve every single day. If they missed one piece of that puzzle, if they forgot to salt the fish or failed to fix a hole in the roof, the results could be a disaster. One bad mistake could destroy an entire family. The center of this world was the longhouse. It was a long, narrow building made from what the family could find nearby. Depending on where they lived, the walls were made of thick wooden planks, large stones, or even layers of dirt and grass called turf. The roof was covered in straw or moor grass. To us, it might look like a long, dark shed, but to a Viking, it was a fortress against the wild. Inside, there were no separate bedrooms. Everyone lived in one big room. Along the walls were wooden platforms. These were used as chairs during the day and beds at night. In the very center of the floor was a long pit for a fire. This fire was the heart of the farm. It provided the only light in the house because there were no windows. It also provided the heat. In the middle of a snowy winter, the fire was the only thing keeping the family from freezing to death. The air inside the longhouse was always thick with smoke. The smoke would rise and slowly leak out through a hole in the roof. It smelled like burning wood, dried sweat, and cooked meat. While it might sound messy to us, this smoke actually helped. It stayed in the rafters and kept bugs away, and it helped preserve the meat that hung from the ceiling. A Viking farm had to be self-sufficient. This means the family had to make, grow, or catch everything they needed. They couldn't call a repairman if the roof leaked, and they couldn't buy new clothes if their pants tore. Every day was filled with chores that started before the sun came up. The father and the older sons usually handled the heavy work outside. They had to maintain the fences so wild animals wouldn't eat their crops. They had to chop wood, massive amounts of wood, to keep that central fire burning all year. Without a huge pile of firewood, the winter would win. The mother and the daughters ran the inside of the house, which was just as hard. They spent hours every day spinning wool into thread using a small tool called a spindle whorl. They would then weave that thread into cloth on a large wooden frame. Making a single cloak could take weeks of work. They also had to cook every meal from scratch, which meant grinding grain into flour using a heavy stone called a quern. There was no fast food in the Viking Age. The most important part of the farm was the field. Vikings grew grains like barley, rye, and oats. These grains were the foundation of their diet. They used them to make thick porridge and flatbread. But growing grain was risky. They didn't have chemicals to kill weeds or bugs. They had to pull every weed by hand. If it rained too much, the grain would rot in the ground. If it didn't rain enough, the plants would wither and die. A failed harvest was the scariest thing a Viking could imagine. If the fields didn't produce enough grain, the family would have to eat famine bread, which was made by grinding up tree bark to mix with the little flour they had left. It tasted terrible and didn't provide much strength, but it kept their stomachs from being completely empty. Beside the grain fields was the kitchen garden. Here the family grew onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans. They also looked for wild berries and nuts in the woods. These were important because they provided vitamins that kept the family healthy. Without these vegetables, Vikings could get a disease called scurvy, which makes your teeth fall out and your body grow weak. Animals on a Viking farm were treated more like tools than pets. Every animal had to earn its keep. The cows were very important, but they weren't the giant fat cows we see on farms today. They were smaller and had shaggy hair. They gave milk, which the family turned into cheese, butter, and a sour yogurt-like drink called skyr. Because there was no ice to keep things cold, turning milk into cheese was the only way to save it for later. The sheep provided the wool for clothing. Every spring, the family would rue the sheep, which means they pulled the loose wool off by hand instead of cutting it with shears. Pigs were kept because they could eat almost anything, including scraps and acorns, and they provided a lot of meat. When winter arrived, the animals moved into the longhouse with the family. They stayed at one end of the house in a section called the byre. The heat from the cows' bodies rose and helped keep the humans warm at the other end of the room. It was noisy and very smelly, but in a world with no heaters, the warmth of a cow could save a child's life during a blizzard. Even though Viking farms tried to make everything, sometimes they needed things they couldn't produce. Maybe they lived near the ocean and had plenty of fish, but they needed iron for a new plough. Or maybe they lived inland and needed salt to preserve their meat. Since they didn't have coins or paper money, they used the barter system. This means they traded one item directly for another. If you wanted a new iron knife, you might have to give the blacksmith 2 chickens or a large roll of wool cloth. Trading was all about what people needed to survive. The most valuable items for trade were wadmal, a very thick, waterproof wool cloth that was used for sails and warm clothes, salt, vital for curing meat so it wouldn't rot during the winter, iron, needed for tools, cooking pots and weapons, dried fish, cod that had been dried in the cold wind until it was hard as a board. It stayed good to eat for years. The biggest enemy of the Viking family was time. Every summer was a race to prepare for the winter shadow. The winter in the north was dark and frozen. Nothing grew for many months. By the end of autumn, the family had to have their storehouse full. They counted every ham, every wheel of cheese, and every bag of grain. They had to be very careful. If they ate too much in the beginning of winter, they would starve before the grass turned green again. This is why Vikings were so good at preserving food. They smoked it over the fire, dried it in the wind, or pickled it in sour whey. One bad winter could ruin everything. If a flood washed away the hay, the cows would starve. If the cows died, the family lost their milk and their heaters. If a storm blew the roof off the storehouse, the grain would get wet and mouldy. There was no store to go to for help. If your food was gone, you had to hope your neighbors were kind enough to share, but they were usually struggling just as much as you. Life on a Viking farm was not about being a famous warrior with a shiny helmet. It was about hard work, day after day. It was about a family sticking together and watching each other's backs. The children grew up fast. By the time you were 10 years old, you were expected to do the work of an adult. You learned how to read the weather, how to care for sick animals, and how to fix things that broke. There was a great sense of pride in being able to survive on your own. When we think of Vikings today, we often think of ships and battles. But the real story of the Vikings happened in these small, smoky farmhouses. Their survival was fragile. It depended on the strength of their hands, the wisdom of their parents, and a lot of luck. Every morning that the sun rose and the family was still healthy was a victory. They lived a life where nothing was guaranteed, making every meal and every warm coat a treasure.